Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and if you're new to the channel, well, you're in for a treat because you see, yes, it's more A to ZX of the Spectrum, the wonderful ZX Spectrum, an 8-bit microcomputer from back in the day that had so many wonderful games, and I'm going to play 5 of them for you today and maybe just have a brief chat about them. So if you want to see what's coming up in this episode, which is a letter N, then you just wait until after these titles. So first up for the letter N, we're going to talk about the NeverEnding Story, released by Ocean Software in 1985. And why the NeverEnding Story, I hear you ask? Was it because it was an all-time classic movie? Well, yes and no. The main reason I want to talk about the NeverEnding Story is it was a text adventure, and this is a genre that I haven't touched on yet in this series. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what a text adventure is, well, it's in the title of the genre. It's an adventure, and it's all done in text. Well, when I say it's all done in text, later examples of the genre had some sort of graphics, they had pictures helping the story along, but for the most part, well, it was all about reading the story and then making the decisions. Now, the biggest problem with this genre, well, it was simply the power or the capability of the microcomputers at the time. Early machines ran on 16k of memory and 48 was probably the standard, which meant there wasn't a lot of room for a huge vocabulary. And let me tell you, with these games, if you couldn't quite nail the vocabulary and especially the syntax of the vocabulary, then you could be stuck on the same page for hours just trying to work out what it was you were supposed to type to move on to the next section. Now, most of these games had fairly standard templates when it came to the inputs. For example, when you were physically moving your character from one area to another, it tended to be go north, go south, go east, go west. Of course, you could also add in northeast or southwest, but you get the point. And of course, to go in these directions, you just simply typed go north, or whichever direction you were looking to go in. Other standard words that were used in most of these games, well, you had look, take, pick up, open. I mean, again, you're getting this. It's simple words for simple actions. And on the surface of it, these games looked quite, well, easy. But as I said before, these games could have you stuck for hours just trying to get the right string of characters to perform the correct action or find the right item, talk to the right person and say the right thing. There were so many options despite such a limited vocabulary. Now, would I recommend you playing the NeverEnding Story, the text adventure? Well, certainly, because it was one of the better examples. It wasn't overly picky with its grammar, its vocabulary and its syntax, and of course it was based on a well-loved movie. So some of the best ways to get hints and tips on the game was, well, simply to watch the movie, and that wasn't exactly a chore. But bear in mind what I've said, these games could be, and were, very often extremely frustrating. The NeverEnding Story, published by Ocean in 1985. Second up for the letter N, we're going to look at Narc, the 1988 Williams game that was ported to the ZX Spectrum by Ocean in 1990. And not only was it ported to the ZX Spectrum, it was ported to other home micros at the time, as well as the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, the game's claim to infamy was the fact that it was one of the very first ultra-violent running gun shooters. One of the earliest games that had parents outraged and demanding justice and have it removed from the shelves in arcades. And yet, on the flip side of this coin, Narc was also the poster game for the war on drugs. And on the arcade and NES port, you had that wonderful splash screen, "Winners don't do drugs." Now, you can kind of see where they were going with this. It was the start of video games becoming ultra-violent. So to get around the backlash that this was obviously going to create, they put in a moral message. And what exactly does Narc have to do against the war against drugs? Well, it's quite simple. You're a narcotics officer, and the main goal of the game is, well, just to blow away or arrest the bad guys who are selling drugs. And along the way, when you kill the bad guys, well, they drop their money and their drugs, making it your job to clean up the city. Now, that's enough of the backstory of Narc. What about the game itself? Well, of course, on the arcades it ran much smoother, looked better, sounded great. The port to the ZX Spectrum, however, well, it wasn't quite there. The good old Z80 chip just couldn't run fast enough to provide the fast-paced action that the game was looking for, and the good old-fashioned colour issues that the ZX Spectrum had meant it was all monochromatic screens again. Now don't get me wrong, being able to play this at home was a wonderful thing because these machines back in the day were absolute coin guzzlers and they would destroy your pocket money in seconds. So paying out the £5 or £10 to play this on a home micro, it was just economic sense, and even though the quality wasn't quite there compared to the arcades, you could still have a reasonable amount of fun with this game. But as always, the big question is this: would I recommend someone to play Narc in the ZX Spectrum today? And the answer to that, well, it's no. Not unless you have an exceptionally good reason to do so, because the game just doesn't hold up. But of course, if you're like me and you're having to make these videos for YouTube, then definitely go for it. At the very least, it will highlight the deficiencies that the 8-bit micros had towards the end of their life cycle. Narc, published by Ocean Software in 1990. Game number 3 in the letter N, we're going to stick with the ocean ports of arcade games, and this one, the New Zealand Story. Now, New Zealand Story was an action platformer where you take control of Tiki, the Kiwi, who has to save his friends and his girlfriend Fifi, who have been kidnapped by a large blue leopard seal. Now that's as far as the story goes, because let's face it, back in the day, stories, they weren't a big deal, it was all about the gameplay. And the New Zealand Story, well, it definitely had that wonderful addictive gameplay back in the day. And unlike some other arcade ports for the ZX Spectrum back in the day that didn't manage to quite pull off what they were trying to do, fortunately the New Zealand Story was one of the better examples. Yes, of course, the old monochromatic trick was used for colour, but that quite suited this game, to be honest with you. And the gameplay itself, well, it was much faster and smoother than many other arcade ports, including the previously viewed Narc, because as you can see from the gameplay, the scrolling in this game is almost perfection for a ZX Spectrum, and there weren't many games that actually managed to achieve that effect on this system. So unlike the previous Narc, I can heartily recommend New Zealand Story if you want to delve into the ZX Spectrum library. It's a great port of the arcade game that plays really well on the system and truly does highlight what could be achieved on this wonderful little 8-bit micro when the right developers got their hands on an IP such as the New Zealand Story. So yes, if you get the opportunity to play the New Zealand Story on the Spectrum, go for it, jump at it, because it's one of the best examples of an action platformer arcade port on the system. Title's New Zealand Story from 1988, published by Ocean Software. For game number 4 on the letter N, we're going to look at Nomad. And Nomad, well, you know what Nomad stands for? It stands for the Nemesis Organization's Mobile Attack Droid. And the reason we need the Nomad, well, Cyrus T. Gross, he's built the Talos asteroid and directed it towards Earth. And only the Nomad can save the day. And as with most stories back in early video game history, well, that's it. That's the story you get, and it's all the story you need. But the real reason I want to talk about Nomad, well, this is one of those games where you might consider it NES hard. Because let me tell you, the Nintendo Entertainment System didn't have exclusive rights when it came to incredibly tough games. Not at all. The 8-bit microcomputers back then, they had their fair share, and this was one of the most brutal. And you know what? It was because of games like this that I believe that older gamers, well, we're the better gamers. Now looking at the gameplay, you might not just appreciate how truly hard this game was. So let me bring you up to speed. To control the Nomad, well, it was tank controls, that's right, those tank controls from Resident Evil that everyone complains about these days. Well, that's what we had to use in this game. But not only that, the Nomad itself had so much inertia and the physics were so close to 0G that, well, anytime you built up any sort of speed in this game and maybe bounced off a wall, well, you went flying back. And when you tried to rectify a hurtling tank using tank controls on an 8-bit micro with those sort of game physics, while trying to avoid enemy fire that is both random and intentional, well, I hope now that you're beginning to see just how incredibly tough this little game was. Now, I don't just like to talk about the gameplay, but of course the game as a whole. And one of the other things I loved about this game was how wonderfully colourful it was. And of course the trick for that was, well, monochromatic gameplay, yes, but only in a small area. Your yellow Nomad operated on a black road. But to inject much more colour into the game, well, the borders of the game's environment if you will, they were full of colour and design. Now don't get me wrong, not a lot of ZX Spectrum games get talked about these days, but it truly surprises me how little time gets devoted to a game like this. So yes, my recommendation is if you can get your hands on a copy of Nomad and the ZX Spectrum or some of the other 8-bit microsystems it was released for, then give it a go. It is tough as old boots, but that was the point of these games back in the day. They weren't supposed to be easy, they were supposed to be incredibly tough and you were supposed to get good. Nomad from Ocean Software in 1985. For the last game in the letter N, let's talk about Tron Software's 1986 game The Ninja Master. Now, just as it is on every other system throughout all of history, for the letter N in video game, you could probably populate the list with a million games titled Ninja something. And 999 times out of 1,000, that game's going to be a side-scrolling brawler, beat-em-up or fighter game. But the reason that I've picked the Ninja Master, well, it's nothing like that. Because as you can see, the Ninja Master was the international track and field of the ninja world. The game wasn't just you beating up bad guys left, right and centre, no. You had to show the ninja world all your ninja skills. And these skills, well, they were tested in a series of different events. But for me, the Ninja Master was so much more difficult than the other international track and field games and clones that were out there at the time. Your reflexes and reaction times, well, they had to be spot on with this game. Yes, it did have the power building events where you would rattle 2 buttons or waggle a joystick furiously just to get to the right power to complete the event, but a lot of the events were all about your reactions. And let me tell you, they did not make this game easy in the slightest. And what was your reward if you managed to complete all these events and get the scores that you needed? Well, you were promoted in the ninja ranks. That's right, you went from a white belt to a yellow belt, and after that you had to do it all again to work your way up to the coveted black belt. And would I recommend anyone playing this game today? Well, for me, yes, because I loved the international track and field games. I loved all the clones that were out there like Hyper Sports and Daley Thompson's Decathlon. So if you do have an interest in the button bashing, joystick waggling, sports competition games, then the Ninja Master was a lovely little twist on the genre. And for me, it's definitely a must play game in the ZX Spectrum library. So there you have it, the Ninja Master from Tron Software in 1986. So there you have it, my friends, another selection of ZX Spectrum masterpieces. 8-bit classics from the microcomputer era, and well, if you don't think they're classics or masterpieces, then feel free to drop down in the comments and let's have a debate about it, because that's what I want you to do next. Drop down into the comments and let's talk about the games that we've just seen, whether you've played them or not. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, as always, I would love for you to leave a thumbs up, because, well, it makes a big difference to the channel, and more importantly, it makes a big difference to me. And if you want to see more content like this, well, the subscription button, it's always there, it's always free, and you can always change your mind if I start making stuff that you don't really like. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and as always, until next time, cheerio!